May be able to this week to close its investigation of the 2001 Anthrax terror. How wonderfully convenient. A fleshed out case characterized as circumstantial by a thorough journalistic assessment, and the lone mad scientist cannot answer any of it because he's dead. Case closed. However, in our third story in the countdown, it may not remove that word circumstantial, and it won't even address the troubling collateral issue, how the Bush administration reportedly pushed FBI Director Robert Mueller to prove this narrative, that the 2001 attacks were in fact a second-wave terror effort by al-Qaeda or by somebody from the Middle East. In the direct aftermath of those attacks, in October 2001, during President Bush's morning intelligence briefings, the director of the FBI, Robert Mueller, was quote-unquote beaten up for not producing proof that the anthrax spores were the work of Osama bin Laden. This according to an unnamed former aide to Mueller, for a now-retired senior FBI official speaking to the New York Daily News. They really wanted to blame somebody in the Middle East, the official said. But even then, the FBI already knew that the anthrax sent to media outlets, including NBC News, and to the offices of 2 U.S. senators, was a military strain, according to this source. Very quickly, Fort Detrick, Maryland experts told us this was not something some guy in a cave could have come up with. They couldn't go from box cutters one week to weapons-grade anthrax the next. As for the evidence now compiled nearly 7 years later against the late Dr. Bruce Ivins, it is largely circumstantial, and a grand jury in Washington was planning to hear several more weeks of it before issuing any indictments, according to the New York Times, citing an unnamed source briefed on the investigation. Sophisticated DNA testing reportedly linked the victims to particular cultures or strains of anthrax for which Dr. Ivins was personally responsible. However, dozens of other researchers would have had access to those same strains. And the primary evidence of Dr. Ivins' mental instability from a therapist who successfully sought a restraining order against him raises a number of questions as well. Let's turn now to investigative journalist and author of Why America Slept, The Failure to Prevent 9/11, Gerald Posner, who has long been following the anthrax story, joined us last Friday, joins us again tonight with our great thanks to you, sir.
Hi, Keith.
Well, this is our conspiracy nightmare come to full fruit. The FBI source says the White House pressured them to blame it on al-Qaeda or somebody in the Middle East. Would there also have been other FBI sources who would have folded under that pressure? I mean, how much did the FBI actually drag its collective feet, revealing what they had to have already known about where that anthrax came from?
Oh, no question that there were sources and officials inside the FBI that would have caved to pressure from the White House. Look, I've been a critic of the FBI for years, from the time they did the Murrah investigation and the Oklahoma bombings and other investigations that they had bungled. They're very, very sensitive to pressure coming in from the White House. And remember, put yourself back in the time. Keith, this is October, a few weeks after the biggest attack on American soil ever. Largest loss of death from a terror attack. They're under tremendous pressure. Everybody's worried about the next shoe dropping. Is there going to be another terror strike coming up? Anthrax is out there, and you've got the President of the United States saying, I want this tied to al-Qaeda. There's little doubt that this pushed some people either down the wrong investigative path. It slowed up the real path from being found who was responsible for it. And they did know, as you said a moment ago, that this was weapons-grade anthrax. They had not gone, the hijackers, from box cutters to weapons-grade anthrax that fast, but nobody, including Mueller, had the guts to stand up to the president and say this is just wrong.
All right, from the New York Daily News story to the New York Times story that the evidence against this late Dr. Ivins is circumstantial at best. There's nobody easier to convict than a dead man. Are you sold on the idea that he was involved? Are you sold on the idea of the lone mad scientist theory?
I'm certainly not sold on the theory of the lone mad scientist. I'm not even sold right now on the fact that he was involved, and I'll tell you why. All we are hearing is one side of the evidence. We're getting it leaked out, as it always is by the government, bit by bit, about what happened. And as you said, it's absolutely, at best, a circumstantial case. The big thing they're hanging their hat on right now is the fact that they have a new DNA type of evidence for bacteria that can isolate this form of anthrax back to a flask that was in the laboratory that he handled, as did at least 10 other people, and possibly dozens. They have him in New Jersey, supposedly, at a time when mail was sent out with anthrax spores from places in Princeton, and they have him holding a P.O. box at a postal office inside of Frederick, Maryland, where some of the envelopes were bought that they think that they can trace back to this. So it's a case where any good defense attorney, a Mark Garagos, an F. Lee Bailey in his heyday, a Roy Black, they would relish this type of case. They could knock it out of the ballpark. I have to say one thing. We cannot allow allow, I really believe this, on a case this important on the Anthrax investigation, for a rush to judgment in a matter in which the prime suspect is dead of an apparent suicide.
And the key witness against that prime suspect now seems to be the therapist who filed the restraining order against him, Dr. Ivins, Ms. Dooley. To put it kindly, that her story doesn't seem to be particularly airtight. Among other things, she misspelled her own job title, therapist, in the paperwork. And this timeline is all screwy. Let's look at this graphically. She says Ivins was committed on July 10th, signed himself out of the hospital on July 16th. Her restraining order was filed on July 24th. How does a biological weapons expert with fantasies supposedly of mass murder get to sign himself out of a psychiatric facility? And what's the deal with this woman?
Well, I'll tell you, the more I look into this, the more questions I have about her. You're right. She did spell therapist wrong on the application for a restraining order. She represented herself, but she did spell subpoena right, although she got the tense wrong. But I must tell you something. Go on. I suggest to any of the people watching tonight, go on. Maryland has a great public records file on the Internet. You can go on there. You can put in her name. You can find out that she has a somewhat unusual past. In '92, she was charged with her husband for battery on her husband. It was a civil complaint. She was picked up with drug paraphernalia at one point. She had a bankruptcy in '99. She is a counselor. She's not a psychiatrist. She is not a psychologist. She's a social worker, but really she's a counselor in a group setting for drug problems. But she had DUIs herself in 2006 and 2007. You have a bioweapons expert who is seeking help because evidently he has homicidal rage, going to a group setting for drug counseling at the same time. And you have her saying that on July 9th he's making threats that are homicidal against her. On the 10th, he's committed. On the 16th, he checks himself out. We don't know how. And what's remarkable about it is she doesn't go for a restraining order for another 8 days, even though supposedly a bioweapons expert with homicidal threats is out there. She doesn't go to the police, the FBI, or even for a restraining order for 8 days. It raises more questions than it gives me answers.
Here we go, down another series of rabbit holes, I think. Investigative journalist Gerald Posner, thanks once again on this. I have a feeling we're going to be talking about it again. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Keith.